Hi internet friends, in today's video I'm going to explain to you the difference between the ISO on your camera, the shutter speed, and the f-stop, or aperture as it's also called. And I'm going to try and simplify it and explain it to you in 5 minutes in a way that's very easy to understand. So let's start out with the aperture, or the f-stop as it's also called. The easiest way to understand this is that it's the hole within a lens through which the light travels into the camera body. It's actually a really easy concept to understand if you just think about how your own eyes work. As you yourself go between bright or dark environments, the iris within your eyes either expand or shrink, controlling the size of your pupil. So in photography, the pupil of your lens is your aperture, or your f-stop as you might also know it. And so you can shrink or enlarge the size of your aperture and allow more or less light to get into the camera sensor by opening and closing your lens like I'm showing here. And what this does to your pictures is that a lower aperture number opens the lens up more and allowing more lights in, and so making your images brighter. The second effect this has is that the lower the number, the more blur you will have behind your subject, the more depth of field you get. So basically when you're shooting a portrait, you want a very low aperture number, you want to let a lot of light pass through the lens into the camera, which blurs the background and allows your subject to pop. Whereas when you're shooting a landscape picture, you want to keep a fairly high aperture, allowing less light to travel through the lens because the hole is narrower. And in doing so, both the foreground and the background of your image will stay sharp and in focus. Now, the shutter speed I've briefly touched on before, and the easiest way to explain this is that what the shutter speed is the amount of time that the shutter is open when you click the release button on your camera. So basically, if you have a very low shutter speed, say 1/30 or so, the camera sensor will stay open for 1/30th of a second, which means that you're going to have to hold the camera really still to get a sharp image, or put it on a tripod. Whereas if you have a shutter speed, say 1/100 or 1/500 or 1/1000, the shutter is only open for 1,000th of a second, which means that basically you're only exposing the sensor very briefly, which means that you can handheld the camera and still get a sharp image. Sometimes low shutter speeds are good. Say if you're shooting in night photography, you want to keep a fairly low shutter speed in order to get in enough light, because you're also getting more and more light the longer the shutter is open. A good use for a high shutter speed is typically for portrait photography, where you want to freeze your subject completely. Typically when you're doing portrait photography, you're hand-holding the camera and you're moving around trying to get the right framing on your subject, and you might be moving a little bit while you're taking your picture, so you want to keep a really high shutter speed so that you're ensure that when you click and take that picture, your subject is frozen and you don't get any streaks from the face or from your hands moving around the camera. So that's why you want to use a high shutter speed. A high shutter speed is also really good when you're shooting in the sun, where it's too bright, so by using a very high shutter speed like 1/1000, you're only allowing very, very little light to hit the camera sensor, and so your images won't blow out when you're shooting outside. So the last thing I want to talk about is the ISO. And most people don't really know what this is, except that it makes the picture brighter if you use a higher number, and it makes the picture darker if you use a lower number. But the ISO, it's also known as the ASA if you're shooting on a film camera, and it's known as the film speed if you're shooting on film, like on a 35mm camera. But what it really is the camera's sensitivity to light. And so now you're going to ask me, so what's a good ISO to shoot at, and why? Typically, the lower the ISO, the better the rendition of colors and dynamic range is going to be in your camera. But at this point in time, most cameras can produce really good images around an ISO of 400 to 640. So typically I tell people, if you want to manually set your ISO, set it to either 400 or 640, and you're pretty good to go in any environment, because that allows you to, if you're shooting in a darker environment, to set a higher shutter speed so you can handhold your camera. So basically those numbers all go hand in hand and you balance them out. I can go into a lot more of that if you guys want to, but for now let's just keep it really simple and try and just explain how each of the three main elements of your camera work: the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. And I hope this did that. And please let me know if you have any questions. I hope this was somewhat insightful, and I hope it wasn't too confusing. I know it can be. Anyways, I hope that was helpful. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to this channel. I'm not quite sure what it's going to be yet. It might not be just photography. I have some weird ideas. I'd like to make drunken food. Leave some suggestions below. What do you guys want to see? What do you guys want to hear about? What do you guys want to do? And I'll see you in the next one.